All right, everybody, welcome. My name is Lucinda Southern. I'm UK Media Editor at Digiday. Welcome to our latest instalment of Digiday Talks. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Orson Francescone. He is the Managing Director of FT Live. FT Live is a 100-person strong department of the FT focused on live events. So they've really had to pivot over the last 2 months or so from the live events to the virtual events. So we're really great to have him join us today. It's going to get a little bit meta because we are talking about events through the format of events. But I'm not going to focus too much on this part because we all know where we are in this current situation. In-person events were hit first by this pandemic, and the outlook for recovery is looking more like January, March 2021. And even that is somewhat likely in terms of in-person events coming back. That's still mired in so much uncertainty, but some of it, we saw this really from what Facebook and Microsoft have done when they were announcing that they were closing their events until middle of next year. So really now is the time for a medium-term strategy for virtual events. Obviously, with in-person events on hiatus, virtual events flooded the market. And it's a saturated point at the moment. This is some research that we did with our publishing executives for Digiday Plus members back in March, where we found that 32% of publishers are reallocating resource to creating virtual events. So if you thought that it was difficult to stand out in a in-person events setting, then it's even more critical and even more difficult to stand out really on a Zoom call or other virtual conferencing software where a lot of the points of differentiation have really been stripped away. But not to take too many pops at Zoom, but clearly it's a good time to be in the video conferencing business, despite some of the issues around privacy and privacy features. But really the tech that we have at the moment is imperfect for the virtual events that are being hosted in a lot of ways. I mean, it's improving all the time, and the thought of making this transition 5 years ago would have been pretty laughable. But any kind of, any sort of publisher wanting, or the other company wanting to make those transitions from live to in-person, that it's going to be very difficult to find all the different features that they want to replicate in a software. So ultimately, the value of in-person to virtual events is very different. So that now then changes the complete economic model of what it is that you can charge for at an event, where the value is, and how you can make money from it. And that seems to be at the position where a lot of publishers and other companies that are making that transition are staying to at the moment. And this was really summed up by Aaron Kissel, Chief Product Officer at Politico, who was a former attendee and a former guest on The New Normal. His session with Brian will still be up on digiday.com, so check that out. When Aaron said that our ability to convene that audience is the same, if not better than before. But he still pointed out that it is important to decouple the monetization with the experimentation piece until we had enough repetitions under our belt. So that is really it's broadened the entire scope of who you want to attend or who you want to have speak at virtual events. But then, you know, that really puts a premium on the content, which is great. But then when you're missing the serendipity of in-person meetings and the being able to meet face-to-face and to gather and to generate leads that are so valuable for events, then trying to work out where those points of value, points of differentiation, and where you can charge for is really the key. So that is more than enough from me. I will want to remind everyone that we want to make these as interactive as possible. So please do ask questions. You've got a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But with that note, I want to introduce Orson. So Orson, over to you.
Hi, Lucinda. How are you? Thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks to the Digiday team. Hello, everyone watching from home. I hope you're keeping safe. It all feels a bit crazy, doesn't it? We're in week 7 or 8 now. I give a weekly town hall to the FT Live team, which is a global team. We're mainly based in London, and then we have teams in New York and Hong Kong. And it's amazing how we're in week 7 or week 8, and it feels more like month 7 and month 8, to be honest. It's incredible how time has warped during these crisis times. But I hope you're all keeping safe and well. And please feel free to ask any questions. I'll try and answer everything I can, and if I can't answer, I'll let you know. So I've just got a couple of slides. Before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about my background, just so you know where I'm coming from. So I started my career as a conference producer with a company called Euromoney Institutional Investor, and by conference producer I mean a content producer. So researching content and launching and running B2B events in the banking, finance, energy and commodity space. And I started in Euromoney in 2005, and that was really when the whole print trade media was taking a really hard knock, and digital had just come in. And a lot of that advertising revenue that wasn't transferring into digital started to find a way into events. And so, when I started running events, our revenue mix was 80% delegate revenue and 20% sponsorship. And then sponsorship grew quite considerably during the digital transition. So, and then 2008 came. And so I guess that was the first big crisis that I experienced. And we were particularly hard hit because it was a financial crisis, and running banking and finance events, it meant we had to scale back a portfolio on our team and then regrow coming out of the crisis. I then moved into general management, and then I moved within the Daily Mail Group. Euromoney at the time was owned by the Daily Mail Group, and I moved to a different division called DMG Events. I was vice president of their London office, and DMG Events is a large-scale exhibition business that runs some of the largest oil and gas, in fact, the largest oil and gas events in the world. And so I was running something quite different there. So exhibition businesses are different from conference businesses, and these were events with 25,000 attendees and revenues in the double-digit millions. And so it was interesting because people who work in conferences and exhibitions tend to be different, but I was lucky enough to experience both business models. And then I moved to the awesome and lovely Haymarket Media, one of the UK's oldest media brands, as director of events there. And as a lot of you will know, Haymarket Media is a multi-brand, now B2B media player. They've sold most of their B2C assets. And so this was a multi-brand portfolio of B2B magazines with event revenues attached to them. And at Haymarket, we had a real mixed bag of conferences, awards, breakfast briefings, but also large-scale exhibitions and festivals. And then I was lucky enough to join the FT last November as managing director of FT Live. And FT Live is primarily a conference business, although we have a consumer festival called the FT Weekend Festival, which is a very successful consumer event for our subscribers. But primarily it is a B2B conference business. And so the reason I want to give you a bit of history on my background is because it kind of shows you that I've experienced different event models and business models. So from conferences to breakfast briefings to awards to large scale exhibitions, trade shows and consumer festivals. And how these are impacted during this crisis is quite interesting because they're impacted in different ways. And so I just want to talk you through some quick slides as to what I've done or what we've done over the past 6 weeks. And so, adapting in a time of crisis is a bit of a cliche, but crisis is a catalyst for innovation is the way I try and look at this crisis. We can look at it negatively, and it is a really difficult, unprecedented, crazy crisis that nobody could ever expected. But let's try and look at it through the lens of innovation. And so at every crisis, we get pushed into innovating, and this has really pushed us to the limits. So that's how I characterize this crisis. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So essentially, we run about 150 events globally. mainly in the financial capitals of the world, as you would expect, and we cover lots of different industry sectors, but they are B2B community content-led but networking events, and they are pay to attend, and our revenue mix are delegate revenue and sponsorship revenue. And I guess the first thing we had to do 6 weeks ago was to move all our events that were taking place between March and June into the autumn, and that was quite a monumental feat, to be honest, because it was involved renegotiating 60 venues and renegotiating sponsorship agreements and bringing over speakers to new dates. And at the time, it seemed like a really tough endeavor, and it was. And of course, as you will now feel, the clock is ticking very fast on this crisis, right? And so 6 weeks ago, we thought, the autumn is going to be fine. And now I'm sure most of you are thinking, are we ever going to be able to run events in this calendar year? And I don't have the exact answers for that. I guess we need to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Certainly, we know that the way the restrictions will be lifted will be slow and gradual, and event businesses will be pretty far down the list, and large-scale events will be at the bottom of the list. And so, unfortunately, I suspect there probably aren't many exhibition organizers on this call, but exhibition organizers are going to fare really, really bad out of this crisis because, for obvious reasons, they have the biggest events and they will be the last ones to be allowed in. And of course, not only the legalities of it, but the psychology of people want to be going to events even if they're allowed to. And of course, the triple whammy is we are in the depths of a recession, and so marketing budgets, travel restrictions, and so the reality is this year is going to be really, really tough for everyone. And so we are now, well, I'll get on to what we're doing at the moment, but what we did 6 weeks ago is we very quickly wanted to launch some digital presence that showed our clients that we could pivot to digital in some shape or form. We called it FT Digital Dialogues, and it actually was a very simple concept. It was a webinar that was nothing special, but it was special for us because we had never had to do webinars. We'd never had to run webinars because we run a very successful live event business with conferences with between 200 and 600 delegates attending and sponsorship opportunities. And so there was never a real reason to launch webinars because we thought, well, we don't need to. We're making good profits through our normal events business. And so if we can go to the next slide, we'll show you what we did. I think and the one after. Thank you. So we came up with this new mini brand, and then we launched it in 4 days. We launched this panel discussion with our chief economic editors and a couple of really important guests. And it was really to show that we could really hit the ground running. And this is now probably 1st of April, so exactly 4 weeks ago, and really kind of in the eye of the storm. And so we knew that there'd be a real desire from our subscribers and non-subscribers to hear from some of the best minds of the FT as to what was happening with this crisis. And so in 4 days we launched this, and we got pretty exciting numbers. So we had 7,051 registrations from all over the world. And very, very high registration rates and very, very high engagement rates. So I think 90% of people watched the entirety of or even 95% of people watched the entirety of the webinar. This seems pretty simple, but we'll get on to the technology aspect. But I'm sure, as most of you on this call are aware, the technology for events is a complete minefield, and it's one that I've been navigating quite deeply for the past 4 or 5 weeks. And I can tell you, I've spent days in demos and conference calls. And as I'm sure most of you will have realized, there is nothing out there that does exactly what you're looking for. And so there are lots of startups, there are lots of subpar solutions. There are some solutions that are more suited towards webinars rather than conferences. Awards is a big question mark. How can you transition an awards program online and still make money out of it? And so it's an incredibly fragmented technology landscape out there. And picking the right provider and the right technology is not easy. And I suspect what's going to happen over the next few months is we're all going to be trying, testing, failing sometimes, pivoting again. It's a bit like when there's an earthquake, right? There's lots of little mini shocks, and it'll take some time for the dust to settle on each of us to find the right technology for our own business model. And so I'm happy to take questions on that, but I've had some very long days and some very long tech meetings. And of course, it's not just what is out there, it's then how you plug it into your own systems and how you make it work with your own tech environment, which is another big headache. So that was really successful. And off the back of that, we have launched, essentially, we are monetizing these webinars through our partners. And the reason is there's a real desire out there from some of the brands that usually work with us and for us is to keep their presence and their brand presence in the community. And also there's a real strong lead generation desire, because even though we're in a crisis, the reality is right now, or when things pick up very quickly, people are going to have to make up from lost ground. And so we are now monetizing the digital dialogues with sponsorship partners. And luckily we have a very strong brand that enables us to monetize those quite well. And you will imagine that the margins on digital events are much higher than margins on running events in hotels, and also the turnaround time is a lot faster. And so again, if you look at it through a positive lens, there are lots of positives to the digital pivot. But this is just a webinar solution, but one that we are seeing is being very popular with our clients. And then we started thinking, well, okay, webinars are fine, but what about, our portfolio of events? And our portfolio of events tend to be 2-day events with 50, 60 speakers and hundreds of delegates. And the technology that delivers a webinar is not the right technology that delivers a conference. And so we've quickly launched, if you go to the next slide now, our next iteration, which is happening next week, it's called the Global Boardroom. Some of you might have heard of it. We've got quite a strong kind of online presence, but essentially it's hitting again on the crisis, but it's bringing the best minds of the world together in one place to discuss how we get out of this mess. And so if you go to the globalboardroom.ft.com, you'll see a pretty incredible lineup of speakers. I never thought we'd be able to pull that together in literally 4 weeks. So we've got about 80 speakers, from Al Gore to Tony Blair to CEOs from all over the world to the chief scientists at the WHO. I mean, really incredible content. But in a way, the digital element has allowed us to reach speakers that we probably couldn't have reached easily or quickly because of the logistics and people's travel diaries and schedules. So there is a positive to all of this. We decided not to charge people for this, which I guess is possibly one of the questions we're going to get about the economic models. And so the reality is we had 4 weeks to launch this, and we wanted to be quick because it's dealing with the economic emergency. And so, usually our lead times on events can be anything between 6 and 12 months. And obviously we knew that if we wanted to convene a senior audience to discuss the crisis, we didn't have that luxury. And so launching an event in 3.5 weeks is hard enough. And some of you will know that trying to get a paying audience in 3.5 weeks is probably not realistic. And so we very quickly made a decision, together with our editorial team, who are offering free coronavirus coverage content at the FT. So there's a coronavirus newsletter that is free to read. And so in accordance with that, we decided to keep the content open for free, and we're monetizing it through sponsorship. So if you go on the website, you will see McKinsey, Ernst & Young, and other sponsors that have come on board. And again, that's been hard because we've had 3 weeks to sell this. But I guess the strength of the brand and the strength of our speaker lineup has allowed us to do that. And we're on about 16,000 registrations today, and we're confident we'll probably get to 25,000 registrations by next week. And that is 3 days of full content. So it's a very extensive, broad content program. And we expect people to dip in and out of that for the 3 days of the program. No one's going to watch 3 full days of content. But essentially, it's a real incredible brand extension for the FT, and it is a monetization of our digital events. If you go to the next slide, I think we're nearly done on my slide. The Digiday covered an article on the webinar, and then the next slide. Yeah, so in terms of what the future looks like, so I've put together internally a digital acceleration plan working group, and so really planning out different scenarios, and the scenarios are, from we get back to live events quickly to we get back to live events not so quickly, and what does that mean in terms of technology, what we provide our clients. We have that busy schedule of events in the autumn that we're not going to run, whether live or digital, we are going to run. And so how we do that, and what format, what technology, what to do with awards, what to do with festivals, what to do with conferences, kind of all have different answers. And so it's complex. It's also exciting because this is all new and it's kind of pioneering territory for a lot of us. I'm sure a lot of you on the call will feel that as well. It's scary. It's kind of frightening. We're kind of going into the unknown. But listen, we've just got to go for it, right? Because standing still is not an option. And so that's what we've done, and that's what we're doing at the FT. And that digital acceleration plan is really to boost very quickly our pivot. And so we've done one webinar. We've got a very large scale event happening next week. And then we need an answer to what I call our B2B community events. And these are events that have been taking place for many, many years. And how do we convene them online, but also how do we monetize them? So that's enough from me on the slides. Lucinda, and please feel free to ask any questions. But Lucinda, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Orson. That was great. And please, everyone, continue to ask questions. And I have a few of my own that I'd like to get through as well over the next few minutes, but I will weave in some of the other ones that are coming through. I think it's interesting because the FT Live team is around about 100 people, but
Correct.
there are very different skills involved in the putting together events in person rather than online. Can you talk a bit about how you had to move quickly and how you had to adapt those skills and what the processes were?
Yeah, listen, that's a really good point. And listen, the reality is that's a work in progress, right? We've got a relatively strong digital marketing team because obviously digital marketing has been a strong pillar of B2B event marketing. And so that's put us in good stead. We're very lucky to have an incredible central FT technology team who have supported us very quickly in this pivot. And so we are fully integrated with a very large, knowledgeable, expert tech team. But the reality is there's a lot of learning by doing. And so as I said, I've been immersed in these technology showcases for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it's exhausting because you're using a different part of your brain that you might have used before. I guess I've got experience of some large technology projects in my past in terms of large event platforms or networking platforms in the B2B space. And so I guess I've got some knowledge, but it's kind of throwing yourself in at the deep end a little bit. In terms of the long term of the skill set, I think that's a really important question. And the reality is, if you're not digitally enabled or experienced, even in the events industry where it wasn't necessarily a prerequisite, then your career is probably not going to go very far, I suspect, over the next few years.
Great. One of the questions, actually a few of the questions are around the technology. So clearly that is something that is a big talking point because there is more than just Zoom out there. And clearly for the global boardroom, which is a much more of an ambitious than a conference call. What have you, talk us through the process of the questions to ask, the different things that you needed to have in an ideal world for global boardroom and how you managed to narrow down those choices?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of you on the call will probably by now realize the minefield, but essentially you've got two kind of subcategories of tech out there. You've got broadcasting platforms, a bit like Zoom or media players, and then you have virtual conference environments. And the way I explain virtual conference environments are they're a bit like an empty venue. And so you have an empty venue, and so there are quite a few out there, and then you populate it with your delegates, and you might have a main stage or a breakout stage. You might have functionality where people can visit stands and set up one-to-one meetings. We didn't go down this route for the global boardroom simply because of the content and the people registered for the global boardroom are, I would call, a heterogeneous mix of people, right? And because the content is so broad and diverse, you're going to get 15, 20,000 people who don't necessarily want to be in the same room and have no reason for networking. But global boardroom is a bit of an exception. Most of our B2B events will be 300-400 people that actually work in the same industry and want to network and be in the same room. And so what we're landing on technology-wise for those types of events is ones that have a really well-developed networking environment, because, and we might get onto this, when it comes to pricing, really you're going to be able to leverage online pricing if you are able to enable that deal-making business-to-business networking element. And so we know that delivering only content online is not something that's easily monetizable, let's be honest. And so if people want to go down a charging a pay to attend model, which I think people should depend, we certainly want to do that, then we need to enable those business networking features. And they're complex because some of the tech out there is rudimentary. Visiting a virtual stand isn't exactly an easy or potentially great experience. But that's where the value added is. And so we need to enable that deal flow. Otherwise, content only isn't going to cut it from a delegate pricing point of view. And then in terms of questions, the big issues that kept creeping up were capacity. So a lot of the technology out there have limits on capacity. The other one was integration with your existing registration systems. And that seems to have come up as a constant headache in terms of APIs, and do you register them on your system or their system? And if it's on their system, how do you transfer data from your website to their system? And where does data protection come into play? So it's complex. So I would say
is that issue from a GDPR point of view rather than a lead gen post event for other people?
Correct. And I'll get into the lead gen bit as well, because that's really important. But from a GDPR plus the FT, we've got particularly tight controls and transfers of data. And so, we came across, for example, I'll give you an example, a technology which is a virtual event environment, which had some amazing functionalities. And we thought we'd found it, and then we scratched on the surface, and they don't use two-factor authentication for their data protection, which is a technical term. But two-factor authentication is when you need a password on your phone to access your database, and that fell foul of the FT's data compliance issues. And so, as much as I liked the tech, I just couldn't use it, right? And they were new to the market. They're a startup, and they're like, well, yes, sorry, we'll do 2FA, but you need to give us some time. But for a big brand like us, we can't take any risks, right? So sometimes we got very close to landing on a solution, and then there was a small technical hurdle that meant that we couldn't use it. And another one was a cap on numbers. So you will find this a lot, guys, is that and they won't tell you this straight away, but halfway or 3/4 down the sales pitch, when you ask them, well, how many people can be in this virtual environment, and you get answers like 100 or 500, it's like, oh crikey, okay. Because the reality is, with digital, we haven't mentioned this, the positive of digital is we can reach global audiences, and so in a way our delegate numbers can grow quite considerably, right? And so when you're running a physical event at the Park Hyatt in New York, well, the reality is, it's unlikely that hundreds of people out of China are going to fly for that event. But it's very likely that if the event is right and the content is right, some people from China may want to register and watch online. And so you will see your numbers inflate quite a lot. And a lot of these virtual event environments have capped some numbers from a development point of view. And so I would say ask them, the questions to ask is capacity, integration with your registration system, and then I guess the business development networking environment and how that works. Then on top of that, and then I'll stop, Lucinda, is your production element, because a lot of these virtual environments are empty venues. But then you still have to get people in either via Zoom or Skype. And then if you want to make it look pretty and you want to put a frame around someone's face, or you want to actual vision mixed to a production standard, you need to bring in an AV company. And so, 6 weeks ago, I thought I'd never have to deal with an AV company ever again. And actually, I very quickly realized that if you want things to look great, and there's nothing wrong with what we're doing today, but if you're charging people money to attend, you want it to look great. Well, then you do have to rely on your AV company again to do that for you. And so it's been a real journey, I guess, and I've discovered lots of things that I never knew, I guess.
And you've set on, obviously you have your tech platform that you're using next week, but what were a few of the key things that the networking part of it, can we talk a bit about that? That seems to be on a lot of people's minds. It's how you're able to then translate that kind of network effects in a virtual setting.
I think it's really important. So for next week, we decided not to go down that route, because having an open access content forum with 25,000 people that have more or less nothing in common, we quickly realized, well, actually, the 25,000 people that are going to watch the global boardroom don't need to or want to network with each other. They're really coming just for the content, and it's free to attend. But on our pay to attend conferences, the networking element is crucial, because we know that the value proposition of B2B events, it used to be mainly about the content. It now is mainly about the business development and networking. So the content is still crucial, because if the content's not right, people won't buy a ticket. But once they're in the venue, we know that people are in the corridors doing business and doing deals, right? And so if you are not able to enable that in a virtual environment, you're going to find charging people to attend very difficult. And on that, as I said, some companies out there do it better than others, but it's clunky, because, you know, visiting a virtual stand is clunky and it's not particularly exciting. Some functionalities out there allow you to pre-schedule meetings with other delegates. There's another provider that has breakout room functions that can be private, and so a sponsor can have a breakout and can invite people to join them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at that very closely. We kind of need all of that functionality, because a lot of our sponsors sponsor because they want to network and lead generate with their clients.
Yeah.
On lead generation, Lucinda, sorry, the other thing to check is your permissioning in terms of opt-ins and opt-outs. And so I guess what we found is that most of these systems are set up as an opt-in. And so if you want to transfer the registrant data to your sponsors, because they're sponsoring because they want to lead generate, you need to make sure that if it's an opt-in, you need to manage expectations. Because if you have 1,000 people registering, we know that people tend to not opt in for sponsorship or advertorials. And so you're not going to be able to transfer the 1,000 registration delegates to your sponsors. And so that's just another thing to look out for, is can you do opt-outs instead of opt-ins, or soft opt-ins, soft opt-outs? I'm getting technical, but it's quite important, I guess.
Yeah, sure. There's a few questions around sponsorship as well that I think is going to be interesting to get into. But you mentioned about charging for virtual events. What sort of price range is optimal? How did you manage to come to a figure, and what are you charging?
So that's a really good question. And I'm sure everyone on the call, everyone's testing, trying, and talking to colleagues. And we haven't landed on a number. You know, the kind of numbers I'm hearing from colleagues in the industry is anything between 30 and 50% of a normal event. So, you know, if you used to charge £1,000 for a physical event, you're probably talking between 300 and 500 pounds. But, you know, I think we're all going to be testing the waters. I think you want to be careful with, you know, once you let the genie out of the bottle with constantly free to attend events, you don't want those audiences to get accustomed to getting that for free. Once we do go back to the live environment, and, you know, we will do sooner rather than later, we still want to be charging people for attendance, because, you know, we're providing lots of value to them. But if we've accustomed to them having it for free, then it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And so, but those are the kind of numbers I've been hearing, Lucinda, between 30 and 50% of a live experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect we're all going to have to try and see how it goes, really.
Can you talk a bit more then around the sponsorship deals? At the beginning, you said that you were having to, when you're renegotiating the deals from earlier in the year to later on in the year, and that was done. That's obviously unsure about when that's going to happen, but were you were rescheduling things with sponsorship as well? This is a specific one from Edgar Hernandez, who says, can you speak to how your sponsorship deals are structured?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Edgar. So by and large, sponsorship is going to hold up better in a digital environment than delegate revenue is. So bear that in mind. I think we're all agreed that delegate revenue is tricky online for the reasons we just discussed. I'm confident on the initial indications is that sponsorship actually is holding up very well, because for us, certainly for the FT, one of the main drivers of sponsorship, yes, is lead generation, but it's also brand alignment and speaking at our events alongside some of our famous journalists. And that doesn't go away. That doesn't go away in a digital scenario. Also, because of our brand, we can reach large audiences, you know, depending on whether we go on a free or pay to attend model, or even a freemium model, which I haven't mentioned. But there may be instances where the content may be free, but the networking element could be a add-on, so you pay extra if you want to do the networking. And we are seeing that actually the sponsorship revenue is holding up very well. And so, the main components are speaking at the event, and that doesn't change. The branding more or less stays, and in a way, it reaches wider audiences than a hotel room at the Park Hyatt in New York, which just reaches the 300 people in the room. If you have your branding on your website, it can reach thousands of people pre and post, during and post event. And so I'm quite pleased to say that actually we're not seeing a push down on sponsorship. I mean, obviously budgets are constrained, some people don't have money to spend on events as much as they did, but in absolute terms we're actually seeing sponsorship holding on very well. As we are going to have to probably augment with content pieces and post-event analytics in a way that we didn't necessarily do in a physical environment, but that the technology enables us to do that.
Okay.
And so sponsorship is looking really good, to be honest.
That's the one thing that you can offer, is because you have the intention and the stats and the data.
Correct. We can track who's watching and who's
yeah.
presenting.
So what sort of things, and this is another question from Edgar, is around the KPIs that clients expect. Yep. Because what sort of things that they want to come out with? If it's just a list of email addresses, then
yeah, listen, different things. Again, if you look at the global boardroom, you will see the types of sponsors that are on that. They're not looking for lead generation, because that product is a brand alignment product, right? So we've got McKinsey as our lead partner. Well, we know that McKinsey doesn't need lead generation, but what they're looking for is brand alignment with some of the greatest minds in the world. And so it really depends what you're trying to run. Now, our webinar solutions, our digital dialogues, they actually are a lead generation solution, right? And so we are getting relatively niche bespoke tech companies that need to talk to CTOs in whatever market they are. And so they are happy with 50, 60 quality leads that come out of a webinar. And so it really depends, Edgar, on the type of events you're running, and it depends on the content you're putting together. So if you've got a very strong brand, and if you're in a publishing environment, and you can sell the brand alignment and the large numbers, so the global boardroom is a global audience of 25,000, and McKinsey gets to align itself with the FT, it's one type of proposition. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have service providers or tech providers that are looking for leads. And so it's different horses for courses and different products and different formats, I guess.
Are you hearing then anything from the advertisers about what they want from the sponsorship, or what sort of, obviously there's the editorial independence of the FT, but is there anything that you're hearing from the sponsorship advertisers that you want to implement down the line?
Yeah, I think, listen, the main things we're hearing is some sectors and some brands just want to go quiet, and so luxury advertising is a big part of the FT's advertising base, and for obvious reasons. Luxury companies do not want to advertise in a time of crisis when we have people in lockdown and in hospitals, and so they don't find it appropriate. And I think CMOs from those luxury big brands are struggling in terms of how to manage a crisis and not come across as insensitive or out of place. So that's a particular. So I think different sectors of different things, and the others is it's really like keeping front of mind with clients in a time when print is not necessarily available, and in a time when live events are not necessarily available. And so I think it's first and foremost the rule of every downturn, really. And so you will have all experienced CMOs who it's the constant struggle of a recession, right? We all know that in a way you want to spend more during a recession, but then the CEO at the top says you need to save costs, and so there's this constant push and pull in marketing spending and advertising. And I think hopefully everyone who's on this call would agree with me that in a downturn you need to spend more and keep your brand front of mind. I guess what happens in the reality is it clashes with the CFO and the CEO who's trying to maintain profitability, and marketing budgets inevitably get slashed, I guess. And so, I guess the reality is stronger brands will win out in a crisis, stronger publishing brands, because with a reduced marketing budget, well, where are you going to put your money? Are you going to put your money with a stronger brand or a more niche brand? So that hasn't changed in this crisis, to be honest.
This is a question from Leila Denise around how you structure your value proposition for sponsorships. Because, are you going to each of your sponsors at the moment and doing something bespoke really, and just working as together on how things go, rather than, I mean, I guess there's no rate card for, or is there, for what's happening
Well,
now?
we run FT Live runs two types of events. We run our what we call our core flagship events, and these are annual events that have been running for many years, and they are discrete events in certain particular industries. So like the US Banking Forum has been running for 20 years. And then we also run a client-tailored event business, which is a kind of white-labeled agency business. And in that scenario, it's complete 100 bespoke, right? 100% bespoke. In the core event scenario, we do have a rate card, and to be honest, it's we haven't changed that. And so, apart from the pressures of reduced marketing budgets, the shift from live to digital hasn't put pressure on that in that sense. And so, in that sense, we have quite structured, pricing programs. Obviously, there's some flexibility in there, but these are flagship events that have been running for years and years and years, and so we're not creating the events for the sponsor. It's the sponsor that wants to align itself with the event. So on that sense, we're quite structured. On our client-tailored event, it is bespoke, but I guess, the brand power gives you pricing power as well. And so I guess we're lucky in that respect, that of course there are pressures in a downturn, but we're better placed to withhold them than, say, other publishing brands possibly.
So what's the, we're actually only got a few more minutes left. But I mean, I guess a key question then is around, you say that things are holding up, but you're putting on fewer events. The margins are different. I mean, the margins are much higher for virtual events. How much worse off are you going to be finishing up the year or something? Or how much more money is it can be generated?
I think it's really hard to tell, and in a way it's too early to tell. And as you said, I mean, possibly because of the economics and the margins. And so, when you're taking out hundreds of thousands of pounds of venue costs out of your P&L, that actually kind of helps in a downturn. Now, whether the drop in delegate revenue that we will see, because we're not able necessarily to charge full price, whether that counterbalances, but we spend a lot of money on venues, I can tell you that, and it's obviously in the millions. And so from a purely P&L management point of view, once you take those out, we'll actually, and we will see a drop in revenues because people are tightening their belt and they're spending less. But I can see a way to getting us where we originally thought we were going to get at the beginning of the year, which is quite exciting, I guess. So, without going into too much detail, but it's difficult, but I can see a route to us delivering what we thought we were going to deliver. Okay.
So it's like more profit, perhaps less revenue.
Possibly.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. We have a few more questions that are quite specific around here. People are very keen to hear about the platform that you're using, which hopefully we can maybe follow up with afterwards to talk about specific ones. One other question, this one's from Brian Morrissey, our President and Editor-in-Chief, which is an interesting question that I would be keen to know the answer to as well, is will this hasten the FT's events business model aligning more closely with its subscription business? And if so, how?
Good question, thanks, Brian. Possibly, I would say. I think we're relatively closely aligned. I mean, buyers of subscriptions are different from buyers of events, right? So the people who pay for subscriptions aren't necessarily always the same people that buy for an event. And so I think publishers are always, and I've worked in lots of publishing environments, and publishers are always obsessed when they look at their event delegate list, they see that actually a lot of the attendees are not subscribers, and they think, well, can't I get them to be subscribers, or why aren't all my subscribers going to my event? And I think it's a really noble cause, and there's obviously opportunities. If your event delegates are not subscribers, there are obvious opportunities, but I guess the holy grail of 100% overlap between subscribers and attendees is I think is a bit of a red herring, because people buy subscriptions and buy event tickets for different reasons, right? And so, event tickets tend to be bought for business development.
Yeah, in the sales departments.
Yeah, exactly. There's a bit of that. But listen, the reality is our editorial team is very, very heavily intertwined in our content proposition on our events. And so from that point of view, and I think probably the global boardroom experience is gelling us even further. So it's an amazing relationship that I haven't seen in other publishers, and it's really successful. and I love it, to be honest. What I can tell you on the subscriber base is that we've done some analysis, and subscribers that have it, and so audience engagement is a really strong metric for the FT, right? So not just revenue, but how long do subscribers spend on the website? How many times do they log in? How do they interact with the FT? And we have some concrete data that shows us that subscribers that have been to events, their engagement rates kind of jumps up in the 4 months post-event and tend to stay higher than they were pre-event. And so that's really interesting data that shows us that subscribers that come to our events then end up interacting more and lasting longer as subscribers. And so there is a direct link there. And we're pushing that very hard. So I hope that answers the question, Brian. But the holy grail of publishers, I want everyone to overlap 100%. It's slight red herring, and you also do want non-subscribers to attend your events because they're coming in through they're filling up your data marketing funnel, right? And so especially if you have shared databases, then events is a way of topping up your marketing database as well, right?
Right. Great. Well, it makes it sound so clean and neat, which is a great place for us to end on. So Orson, thank you so much for joining us and for talking.
Thank you, Lucinda. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe. Don't stress. We will come out of this head down, but it's going to be great because the industry is going to be transformed. I think it'll be transformed for the better. So stay positive.
Definitely a positive note for end on. Thanks a lot, Orson, and thank everyone else for joining us.